podcast. All right. The Hangout on Air is live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Watching 100 Movies, a podcast that Mike and I do sometimes.
Yes. Watching 100 movies over 100 years.
Yes. I remember feeling some anxiety for a while about the original version of this list came out in 1997, and then they did one in 2007. And when 2017 came along, I was thinking, are they going to do a new version of the list and mess us up? Thankfully, they didn't, but it's been an ongoing process. In any event, we're making our way through the list. We're getting there slowly. Tonight, we're talking about numbers 32 and 31. So we've broken through the first 2/3 of the list.
Yes.
And you could call it the home stretch, I suppose. Although I think home stretch would be, I guess, to properly use the baseball term, would suggest we should be 75% through.
Yes, I guess that would be. Trying to do the. I was like, wait, the what? The seventh inning? What? No.
Home stretch.
Third base to home. Got it.
Yeah. Although I feel like, well, I don't know. I never mind. Could go on a whole tangent there that's really not important. Tonight, we're talking about movie number 32, The Godfather Part 2, and number 31, The Maltese Falcon. So let's, without further ado, talk about The Godfather Part 2.
Yes, let's do that.
All right. So let me preface our discussion by wanting to caution everybody that I might have some less than 100% positive things to say about this movie. And I don't want to be taken as telling anybody that they shouldn't like it as much as they do or anything. I'm not even really criticizing any of the craft of it, except that personally, on a personal level, I just don't engage with the story very much.
Wow.
So I recognize it as an expertly made movie that I don't find super interesting on an emotional level.
That's different than how I feel about it.
That's fair. There are lots of things that I really, really love, and not everybody else feels as strongly as I do about those things. So it's just one of those things. So I guess I wanted to just say that up front, just because I know and I respect that a lot of people really, really love this movie, and I don't want to tell anybody they're wrong. So I won't.
Often comes up in the discussion of, can a sequel ever be better than the original, not just as good?
Mm-hmm. And I would say that the list probably doesn't rank them that way. Godfather Part 2 being number 32 and the original being number 2. So at least in the list form. But at the same time, certainly when you're putting it all into perspective of that sort of thing, because I don't think that there's a large number of people who will be more angry when I say that I feel somewhat similarly about the first Godfather. So it's not for me like, well, I don't like Part 2, but Part 1's a masterpiece. It's more like I consider them both really, really well-made movies about characters that I don't find sympathetic.
So that's good context, because that makes a lot more sense why you don't like the second one, because you're not as invested, and that's the beauty of the second one, is the tapestry that it paints from these characters that we got to know in the first one by getting the background on Marlon Brando's character with the flashback scenes with De Niro, by furthering the transformation of Michael, which was obviously one of the key story arcs of the first one, and just taking that to the next anti-hero level.
See, that's where maybe part of the divide is going to come, is that to my mind, Michael in this movie is not an anti-hero. He is straight up a bad guy.
Yeah.
The only positive things about him are themselves twisted to evil ends. And so while I find the flashback Vito somewhat more sympathetic, it's all in the context of knowing that it still all leads to what we're seeing with Michael, which makes it hard to root for any of it, in my personal opinion. Now, I don't want to overstate it. It's just a matter of when a lot of people talk about this movie like it's their holy grail. And I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but I don't feel that.
Well, I think it's interesting to have this conversation because you're right. Like a lot of the things that are bothering you are part of what make this really compelling to me. Like, so in the first one, we are rooting for Michael. Mm-hmm. And we're kind of saddened when the final frame, not to spoil the first movie, but is of him essentially taking his father's place as the head of the family. When he was never intended to be. He was supposed to be the one that got out of it. And, he was the war hero. He had a respectable business. And he had this idea that he was going to take the family straight that doesn't end up ever materializing. He just has further and further descent, not just as a mob boss, but as a person. Mm-hmm. And when he's, forcing his wife and sister to do what he wants and killing his brother, he's just, like you said, he's evil. But the flip on this is, so in the first one, we kind of see, Vito as his father as the bad guy because he's the mob boss and Michael's our hero. This one, it's flipped. We're actually rooting for the younger Vito and empathizing with him as he goes through because that transformation and shows how like he's such a sympathetic character and he's entertaining and he's doing it for the right reasons when he first gets started off, and then you're watching the framing at the end. You have to have seen the first one to really appreciate this one because you're taking and you're saying, wow, that's exactly like what happened. Not exactly, but it's the same process of what happened with Michael. Like there is no good here. To me, it's almost like, it's like the second half of Fight Club, where he's the bad guy. Like this, when you take this out to its logical end, this doesn't end well. And that's kind of what's happening here, just over a long, more complex storyline. So that's why I love it, because
and I'll confess to being at least a little bit uncertain in my own mind why I felt the way I do about this one, whereas there are other stories I can think of where, at the very least, the protagonist is not sympathetic. Breaking Bad comes to mind. Walter White in that story starts mostly sympathetic, but turns into a monster over the course of the series to the point where by the end, I feel like it is astounding to me that anyone would still be rooting for him at the end of that series.
Goodfellas.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, that's a good example. Because especially that's like in sort of the mob context too, right? It's part of that whole, subgenre.
Yeah,
mob
it is.
Movie,
But it is a similar, framing where he starts out as a good-natured kid who's just who just ends up hanging out at the place to the point where he's like this monster by the end of it that where you're not. It's delivered at the end like you should be happy for him that he got into witness protection and now he's like living next door to you, but it's like so eerie and creepy because he's like this terrible person and now he's just living next door to somebody in a suburban home. And and so it leaves you with that kind of that similar feeling. That's why I brought that up.
Yeah, no, I it's a good comparison, and I'm not sure why. I wonder if part of my reaction is a little bit of just a knee-jerk thing against people who go on and on about Godfather movies. You know what I mean? Like, I wonder if there's a psychological aspect that's holding me back there just because, so I guess what it is that I'm not 100% sure why I mean, what it feels like it is, my lack of enthusiasm feels like it's because I don't have anyone to root for. But there are other stories like that I don't know why I would feel the way I do about this one and not those. I'm not sure. But we don't necessarily need to spend our whole discussion interrogating that, because there are a lot of things about the movie that I definitely respect. And so we can talk about that in the broader context. And I don't know, maybe as part of the discussion, some more of it will click. That's happened before in these discussions.
Yep.
But yeah, I think it's really overall just it's clearly an incredibly well-crafted film that is setting out very deliberately to accomplish a goal, which I believe it succeeds at. So in that context, that's one definition for a great movie, right? And it's more like, I don't know. I just kind of, I feel like I couldn't engage with its gears somehow. Anyway, so how about this? You want, I don't want to, I feel like I don't want this to be like the only conversation, you know what I mean? Like, so, I don't know, we could talk about the awards that it won, or?
Yeah, why don't we go through that, because this movie really is, from a crafting standpoint, to further what you said, I mean, it's firing on all cylinders, to use that metaphor.
Right.
I mean, it is, like, you said it lays out with a goal and it accomplishes that, but it does that through an incredible script, that just takes you through, just the way, the pacing of how it's told, the way that it interweaves the flashback scenes, and how that enhances not just our understanding of all of these characters, but also paces it really interestingly. The performances across the board are just, I mean, they're just phenomenal. I mean, Pacino and De Niro obviously get the most of the recognition, but there's some secondary characters in there that just really, really deliver. Particularly, his sister and his wife. Who's that? Is that Talia Shire?
Talia Shire is his sister,
and
Connie.
Faye Dunaway?
Diane Keaton, isn't it?
Diane Keaton. Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Diane Keaton is his wife. They have tremendous performances. Even though they're very small pieces in the movie, but they're so critical to our understanding of how terrible Michael has gotten. Because if you can frame it in that, he's just like this bad mob boss, but when he's like a bad brother, family member, husband, and he's not bad, he's not like in The Sopranos, he cheated on his wife. There's not really any indication of that here. Not that it's not happening, but he's just manipulative and controlling of her in a way that makes it they chose not to take the shortcut and say, he could just have this mistress and then we know he's a bad guy. But but you need that powerful other person to show that she was a strong woman. She's trying to stand up to him and she can't, because he's that powerful even to her.
Yeah.
So I think that one's a little bit not underrated, because obviously everybody knows that she did a great job, but it's for being a smaller part, it is so key to understanding the movie and what it's trying to do, And then the cinematography and the way that all the different scenes have different grains, different color, different, you get a different feel depending on what mood and what's happening. And Fredo is a great character too. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's like all of these things, none of that I can disagree with. I mean, that's I think all of that is true. It's all of these characters are definitely well portrayed, well written. We get the characters. One of the things that I think is interesting from the context of what you were just talking about in terms of Michael being bad in multiple dimensions, is that this movie, especially drawing a contrast with his father as a younger man, wasn't like that. So it's not even like the excuse we sometimes see with abusive male characters that like, oh, it's perpetuating a cycle of abuse, because it's really kind of not. I mean, Sonny was kind of like this, but Vito wasn't as much, or at least it's not really depicted that way.
Right. No, he's depicted as getting into this because of trying to like take care of his family, and he's always respectable on the family side.
Yeah.
He always treats his wife great. You know, he's doing this to help out with her and the kid. You know, he even, you know, he accepts getting fired from his job with, you know, just a smile and says, I guess I'll find another job. You know, he's just doing everything with this, you know, this level of respect. And then so what you kind of see is, okay, that's why he ended up a little bit differently. Like, he was still the bad guy in the first movie, but everything was around this respect thing, you know?
You know, that's interesting that you say that. It's maybe been a little while since I watched the first one, but you said that a couple of times, that Vito is like the bad guy in the first movie. And I'm not sure I ever felt that way, because on the one hand, there's rooting for Michael to not get involved, at the same time that I think we kind of always know he's going to, right? Like, this is the story of him getting involved despite himself, right? But I don't know. I never thought of, even though I think it's a trope more than it was ever a real thing, I always felt like, you know, Vito in the first movie is portrayed as the one mostly noble guy in a den of thieves.
You know, that's probably fair. You know, I always just think of, like, in contrast to Michael, because, like, you know, he's what Michael's trying not to become. So that's why I look at him as the bad guy, like the antagonist, essentially, because he's framed against what Michael's trying to, you know, be.
Right.
And that, he is noble, and he's always noble, and he's very loyal to his family. I mean, even in the scene where he ultimately passes away, like, he's playing with his grandchildren, but he just does these horrid things, like putting, you know, it opens with the horse head in the bed, and then, you know, the climactic scene is the orchestration of the killing of all of the casino people in one day, and, like, it's just, so he's almost the bad guy in the fact that, like, he's of two minds, you know. He's this noble family man on one side, and then this just absolutely, you know, cutthroat businessman on the other side. And so there's a little mix of that, as saying, okay, well, he is the one noble person among the den of thieves, but he's also the worst thief, you know, like, he's the most evil thief in a way.
What that actually just makes me think of, ties back into something that happens in part 2, but I'm not remembering the name of the stand-up comedian, so I apologize, stand-up comedian, who I'm about to tell some of your jokes here for my own benefit, but I'm at least not going to take credit for them. But it's to paraphrase the bit, he's just talking about the genius of an invention of young Vito in when it comes to finally taking control of the local organized crime, is that he comes up with the ingenious breakthrough idea of shooting him with a gun. Oh, it's this guy. Nobody dares touch him. Well, have we tried shooting him with a gun? Well, I guess no one's ever tried it. We have no way to know if it would work, but it's so crazy, it might do the job. Anyway, I'm sorry. I don't mean to. That's kind of a distraction, but it is. Ultimately, that's kind of what his plan is that he just kind of sneaks across the rooftops, does it on a chaotic day so that he doesn't get caught. But it's also not necessarily an intricate plan.
No, and he doesn't botch it. That's not the right way to say, because he does ultimately succeed, and it is very clever, but, you know, he is kind of awkward with it. You know, he doesn't shoot him right away, kind of hesitates. He's got this whole idea of having the towel around it as a silencer, and of course it catches fire. And, you know, so it's not, again, he doesn't fail, but it's like he's so new to it.
Yeah, it's not smooth.
It's not smooth. Yeah, it's not smooth. That's a good way to put it. You know, because he like I said, he's ultimately successful. But yeah, it is funny. But
Yeah.
Well, and I think the point of having him so likable in this movie is that what we were just kind of finishing with that discussion on the other one is he is this noble guy who does these horrible things. That's why I look at him as the villain. If you're looking at Michael as our hero, this is the villain that's putting him in the position to not be able to be the hero. Even if he's not actively like doing that to Michael, and then so you come to the next one, and that's what makes Michael's evilness across all facets so important, is that he's not the same. Like there's nothing noble about Michael by the end of this. Like he's not a good family man. He's not a good person in the community. He's just not a good person at all.
Yeah.
And like you said, you can't root for him. And you're just sort of left watching in awe as he just descends further and further. Like I said, finally culminating with, the shooting of his own brother. Not himself personally, but the ordering of the execution of him.
Yeah. Well, and in total cold blood too, because it's not even like he deliberately makes the decision to not have his brother killed until after his mom is dead.
Right.
And then at the funeral, his sister comes to him and says, "Come on, can't you make up?" And he's like, "Oh, okay." And then he, looks over to his guys like,
now that mom's gone, he can be gone.
Yeah, finally.
Well, and that's why Fredo is such a great small character too, because just the way that he portrays like being the weaker brother and being and like what his motivations were for why he got himself in trouble, why he ratted him out in the first place, because he's trying to be strong and he's tired of everybody calling him stupid, but he is actually kind of stupid and inept, and he's all of those things, and he doesn't want to be. And in the end, he accepts his own, like he knew that was going to happen, like that, and he sort of plays it off as like,
he's babbling the whole thing about praying while he fishes and.
Right. And then as soon as the kid doesn't get in the boat, he's like, as opposed to being like, well, I guess we won't go. Like, why would you just go fishing with like the bodyguard? Like he knew what was going to happen. He knew he didn't have a way out of it. And so he just went and he prayed. And, again, in just like a weak way, but still like nobler. He's just such a complex guy. Like, there's not really he's not a trope or a stereotype at all,
One detail that strikes me as really clever visual storytelling is the whole bit where he tries to explain his betrayal to Michael while reclining on a lounger. And it's just like the blocking and body language of it, just like it's all of that stuff. You know what I mean? It's kind of like he's like an animal showing his belly to the alpha.
Yeah, but you can almost see like in his mind, he feels like he's the same as like, like he's like being like the Godfather sitting in the chair, but he's like not doing it right. Like you said, he's exposed and weak, and So.
Yeah. So I think, you used the word anti-hero earlier, and I would classify that maybe Vito in this movie could fall into that anti-hero category, because even though he does certainly commit crimes, pretty much all of the crimes we see him do are in the service of something that could potentially be called a good. He kills, what was it? The Black Hand, I want to say is the guy's nickname. Kills him. He was clearly a bad guy. So like getting rid of him, even if it's got a partially selfish motivation of being able to take over what he's doing, but killing him so that you don't have to keep paying this bad guy who's extorting people all over. You could say that, and getting revenge on what's his face over in Italy. For, killing his mom and brother and dad, like that, that's revenge. That's classic anti-hero stuff. Right. But because this movie does very deliberately set that in the context of the larger story that we know, both the part we know and the part we're learning about Michael now, which is that even if he had good intentions, we still see that the results are awful. And so in the context of like recognizing that, knowing the tree by its fruits, so to speak, it's there's no such thing as good intentions leading to good outcomes in this milieu. I think I said that wrong, but but yeah, there is no good guy in this story.
Right.
Because even Vito, having somewhat noble aspirations, still engages in the criminal underworld in such a way that all of this consequence happens as a result.
Right.
And, by the end of this one, any semblance of nobility there ever was is definitely gone. I wonder if maybe part of what I wanted from this was like at least a side character that I rooted for or something. I'm not sure if that would have made the difference. But, the character who perhaps even just as a victim of Michael is kind of a good person, and is kind of could be like our viewpoint character, but it's just the movie doesn't really do that. Like, I don't think there are any good people in the movie.
I mean, yeah, I guess his wife and his kids are the only thing that are close, but they're used to a different end,
Yeah. Well, and also there's like, it's there's a complicit, well, the kids are innocent, but even Kay, who by the end is actively doing things that she knows will infuriate him just because she doesn't know what else to do. But she's, we remember the end of the first movie where she was, there was made very clear of this whole thing of like, you can be with me, but you stay out of the business. And like, we're meant to be unsettled by that in the first movie.
Right.
And we get an echo of that at the end of this one.
Yeah, she's definitely like naively complicit at the end of the first one.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh yeah, he says he's going to take it legitimate eventually, and she doesn't even believe what she's saying. But
yeah,
and that's what's sort of tragic at the end of the first movie.
Yeah, and I think that not to, because obviously it is an abusive relationship between Michael and Kay, emotionally abusive at least. I don't recall, does he actually hit her? I don't remember.
I think he slaps her in one scene.
Well, maybe it might even be the scene where she tells him that it wasn't a miscarriage, that she had an abortion. So it was like on purpose. Yes. Like, I aborted your son on purpose, which, not to excuse him hitting her at all, but at the same time, like, if there was going to be a time that he would ever hit her, it would probably be then.
Yeah, it's that scene. He does. He jumps across the chair and like slaps her.
Yeah. And so that, not to, belittle any element of the abuse that she suffers at his hands. And I know that can be a complicated thing for women in an abusive relationship. So I don't want to just make it about like she's bad because she should have left sooner, because that's complicated, especially if you're worried that your husband might have you killed if you leave.
Right. The core of the abuse is emotional and control. It's not the physical part. The physical part, like you said, it only comes across, not only like it's like it only like it's ever okay, mm-hmm. but that's the only time the movie uses that tool, is because he's just so enraged by his response. Because what it's trying to say is like he's not always physically abusive to her. What he is mm-hmm. always, though, is emotionally and controlling of her, which is what makes it so difficult for her to leave. Like, because that's where his abuse is keeping her there and keeping her doing complicit.
Well, and that's why her having an abortion is like, that would be such a violation in his eyes, not just because of the faux Catholic stuff, but also because it is her trying to wrest control of her own body away from him. And because that is the core of his abusive relationship towards her, that would infuriate him like nothing else. And I feel like I lost my train of thought, what I was going to say about that. I think one of the things you said earlier that I thought was interesting was the question about like if they showed him cheating, having a mistress or something, like, and being a bad guy in that way, which they definitely don't, right? Like I'm pretty sure, but at the same time, they don't really ever show him being especially affectionate to her either. He seems kind of like, I don't want to tar him, especially since, you know, asexual is kind of an emerging category that people are being aware of, you know, but I'm not trying to say that about him exactly, except that as a character as portrayed in these movies, he doesn't seem especially sexual at any point.
The only time he is when he's younger and he's in Italy. And his wife, he marries that girl, and he's super passionate with. Like that's the girl he has like the most passion with, and then she's blown up in that car bomb.
Right.
And then after that, he sort of
just kind of shuts it all down.
Shuts it all down. Like he's more dispassionate, I guess is probably a better way than just to say asexual. Like he's dispassionate towards women.
But yeah, presumably they were having sex because there's pregnancy involved, right? Yes. But
he's not. That's why I say dispassionate is better, because if they are doing it as a utility to have the kids, as opposed to they're passionately intimate, you know.
Yeah, and so his thing, such as it is, isn't really sexual in that in the sense of, like, you know, you talk about Tony Soprano, like, you know, many other characters, the idea is part of the appeal is being able to have anything you want. I want that girl, so I'm going to sleep with that girl. You know, I want the family too. I'm going to have that too. I want all of that. Whereas
the Goodfellas character as well, Tony, you know, those kind of.
Right. Whereas Michael is much more like he has decided what he wants is Kay, and he has Kay, and he's going to make sure he continues to have Kay. You know, but that's like now that, like, when she is doing what she's told, that part of his life is under control and he doesn't have to worry about it. He focuses on other things. Like the fact that he comes back and hears that she's had a miscarriage, like, that's the first mention of her in the movie for like an hour. You know, so it's not like he's constantly thinking about her or worried about her or especially concerned that they're hiding from potential assassins while she's pregnant. You know, like, it's a brief mention early on, but then it's not like a constant ongoing thing. It's more like, you know, it's another thing he has to deal with.
Yeah, that's why I felt like it was important to point out, you know, again, her and Talia Shire's performances, because, like you just said, they disappear for hours on end in the movie. But the parts where they exist are so poignant to giving that extra layer to the story, and really, and like I said, showing him as bad on all fronts, as opposed to like Vito, who was a pretty terrible guy from a business perspective in the mafia, but always noble and did well and treated his family like
it's just business. It's just business. You know, I don't know actually if he said that. I don't know if that was a Vito line.
There's something like that, similar to that,
But so, but there a lot of you know, solid performances in this. Like, you know, Fredo, you kind of mentioned already. We talked about him a little bit, but just this idea of him as a complex, nuanced character that we get. We understand Vito. We are able to wrap our head around, who is this guy? What is he like? What's his deal? And we understand, like, you know, he is just so well conveyed in that regard, right? Did I say Vito? I was meaning to talk about Fredo. I feel like a lot of. Okay, good. That because just this idea of it being obvious to us, the audience, from frame one, that he is less well suited to this life than Michael is, in terms of being a leader of anything, for sure. And yet, feeling that being passed over for that explicitly reflects negatively on him. Instead of just saying, you know, gosh, Michael's really good at that. How can I help? It's more, there's this resentment there, but also a fear to take him on directly. You know, so instead of going to Michael and trying to, you know, have it be a continuing negotiation with him, he's intimidated by Michael. And so he ends up basically just talking shit with other people with whom he shouldn't, that starts getting ahead of itself and out of control to the point where, oh, wait, partly as a result of something that I was involved with, they just tried to have him killed, and that's potentially going to lead back to me, and that's really bad. And that's where he's trying to just call it all off, but it's, you know, the avalanche is in motion.
Yep.
Yeah. There was one thing that I found a little bit, like, I feel like I followed it even while watching, but it's certainly complex. Just the whole, you know, mystery of who really did it, right? Because, like, had, you know, the assassination attempt. When you know, when he goes and talks to the New York guy, or so he talks to Roth first.
Right.
The synopsis I read said Roth tells him he thinks it was this other guy, Frank, that did it. Frank Pantangeli, I think is the name.
Yep.
And then he goes to Frank and says he knows that it was actually Roth. But I feel like that synopsis oversimplifies what happens in those scenes, because to my mind, it feels much more like that bit in Game of Thrones where Tyrion goes around and he tells a different version of what he plans to do to the 3 different people that he thinks might be informing on him to Cersei. Yeah. And so then, based on what Cersei comes to yell at him about, he knows which person betrayed him. So I felt like it was more like that, but it was still all kind of complicated. And then the fact that when the assassins come to kill Frank, one of them says Michael Corleone sends his regards, or like says hello, I think, something like that. Mm-hmm. And so at this point, I'm like, wait, so is that like, what's happening? I felt like that stuff was a little bit complex. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it's meant to be complicated.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding though was that it was all of them. Mm-hmm. And that's why it was sort of hard to navigate, because it was Hyman Roth working with Frankie Pantangeli, or whatever his name is. So
it's something like that, yeah.
Yeah, working with him to get rid of Michael because they both had beef with him, and Fredo because of his connection through, you know, so Frankie was the guy who like organized the actual hit. Mm-hmm. But Hyman Roth was a guy that kind of teed it up because Fredo and his, like, not his bodyguard, but like that guy that's always with him, like his lieutenant essentially, mm-hmm. were close, and so Fredo kind of tipped him off and let him, you know,
Johnny Ola was
that? Yeah, exactly. And that's because that's how Michael figures out the connection, is because he introduces him. And then later, when Fredo's drunk and just having fun at the party, he talks about how he found this party because Johnny Ola is the one that showed him where it was. And that's when Michael realizes He's
Yeah.
lying about knowing him. He's always known him. So that's where they're all together. And that's why when it kind of comes to the end and Frankie realizes that he's lost, Michael lets him have the honorable way of dying, by killing himself, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The whole story about, the ancient Roman generals.
Yeah, it just sounded like he made up. Yeah.
Yeah. And just kind of, here is a story I'm going to tell you about someone who killed themselves knowing that their families would be taken care of. Just thought that might be an interesting story to you. Bye. But yeah, so all leading up, so we get, to finish this movie like we finished the first one with, a whole bunch of people getting killed. And I think that the fact that whole narrative is kind of complicated and some elements of it a little ambiguous, namely like what exactly was the plan, who specifically, initiated what part of it and working through who, like a lot of it is kind of even to the extent that we learn what happened, it's all kind of an tangled up mess, right? Lots of competing alliances and double crossing and complicated. So it's a web of deceit. And the fact that, but I mean, I think that's all by design, right? Like that's what the movie is trying to tell us with that plot line, is that when you live in this life, you do have to constantly suspect everyone, even perhaps especially your closest business partners.
Right. Yeah, you're right. By design, it's not meant to be clean.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly how everybody's involved. Like it does obfuscate that a little bit, like because it's not, and part of it I think is by design to be the point, not just what you're saying, but also to show like it's of secondary importance. This isn't a mystery to be solved. Like
Right.
That's not the point of the movie, is to figure out who tried to assassinate Michael.
Mm-hmm.
It's more the feeling of what all of this is like. And so by purposely obfuscating exactly how it all went together and making it of secondary importance, we focus more on the results of what happens next and what does Michael choose to do about it and what is Michael behaving like,
Right. One thing I definitely appreciate in these movies, unlike some films that are somewhat lesser in this regard, is that there's really no moment where it's clear that there's anyone who has just really got it all figured out and is a step ahead of everyone else. Everyone is just reactive in this story, right? It's everyone, even when people make a proactive move, it's always in response to some other thing that happened, right? Everyone is, Michael, like a part of that whole thing is that Michael can't be 100% sure who did it, but there is an extent to which it actually doesn't matter who did it, because whoever it was, everyone who's watching him now is going to form their new opinions of him based on what actions he takes now. And so he almost has to keep moving forward and try to take steps based on never being 100% certain.
Yep.
And I think that's all interesting. And then likewise, we talked a little bit about, Vito, and it's, again, like, to the extent that he ever has any kind of a master plan, it's not really that complicated, and it still doesn't even go necessarily all that smoothly, even if it's ultimately successful, right? So it's, I guess what I'm just like, I think one thing I appreciate is not having any character be depicted as sort of like the mastermind, the genius mastermind who has it all figured out, because that's kind of a trope that can work in some kinds of movies, but not when it's grounded as this.
Right.
It would feel implausible for someone to really seem like they have everything figured out, because it's all complicated, you know. You know, you could argue like the mole in Michael's house that betrayed him is his brother, who actually didn't want him to be killed, and it was all kind of complicated and messy. And so it's not like, you know, every relationship in his life is that way. Is, you know, it's ambivalent. One of the things that we haven't talked about very much yet is the, you know, we've talked a lot about the story, like the writing and the acting, but not as much about the, like the filmmaking, I guess, like the cinematography and set design and all that sort of thing. The Oscars that this movie won, it did win Best Picture. Robert De Niro won Best Actor in a Supporting Role. Pacino was nominated for Best Actor, but lost it to, I could look that up in a minute, but he didn't win. Best Director to Francis Ford Coppola, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Art Direction, Best Music are the ones that it won. The score obviously is iconic. I mean, I wonder though, like, not that the score isn't great, because I think it is, but the element of, you know, the fact that the music is iconic, do you think it is that the music is that good, or do you think there's an extent where it's extra iconic because the movie is so well remembered in its own right?
I think both.
Okay. It's not necessarily even a meaningful, important distinction to make. But certainly, you know, I mean, everyone knows kind of that, you know, that classic theme, which really is introduced in the first one. But, you know, just that whole style that it evokes, you know, bringing all of that in. I keep getting a little bit distracted because at least my preview on the Google Hangout is got a half-second delay. So just when I watch it, it's a little bit behind me, which is always a little weird. Hopefully that's not gonna be any kind of an issue in the final result, but well, you know, we'll see. It should be fine. But certainly one of the things that's striking about this movie, watching it today, is the density of detail in his scenes, right? Like, there's always a lot going on in every shot of this, not necessarily dynamically, but just detail, right? There's furniture, like even if it's just a simple shot of Michael, you know, sitting in a chair pondering like he does, you know, at about 57 points in this movie, which I'm joking, but it's true, right? You know, there's a lot of shots of him just. But even when that's all that's happening in the shot, is there, you know, there's clearly like a lot of set design. There's a lot of stuff in the background, right?
Mm-hmm.
And certainly you also have the big set pieces where there's just dozens and dozens of extras and all sorts of just complicated. There's lush with detail, these shots.
Yes.
Right? I'm trying to say more nice things about it.
No, I think the two things you were just talking about there, the score and the lushness of shots, like, it's part of what makes this, like, I always describe this movie kind of like a tapestry,
mm-hmm.
You know, and it's part of what the weave that makes it so rich, you know. So it just, like I said earlier, firing on all cylinders, like every single craft piece just makes this scene, like I said, just, like, again, I can't get away from that word. Like, it's just such a rich movie.
Mm-hmm.
From the cinematography side, from the score side, from the pacing and the tone of the movie, the delivery by the actors, like, everything is so tight. And just, if any of those was deficient, it wouldn't be the masterpiece that it is. You know, there's not any one point other than what you pointed out, that there's nobody to root for, but that's also part of the point of the movie, you know, where the movie slips. Like it
Right.
literally just ticks everything.
Yeah, I mean, you know, like just I guess to come around on it again, it's none of the things that I cited as reasons that I didn't necessarily engage with it as much are things that the movie were that they're not like failings of the movie as though it tried to do something different. I mean, it set out to tell a very specific story and accomplished that goal. And it just happened to be a choice of story that didn't engage with me as much personally.
Right.
But it wasn't by accident, right? Like it's a very deliberate telling of a very specific story, and it achieves that extremely well. You know, I maybe it's a little there. Maybe there's just an element of it's kind of like you could have the best chef in the world make you eggplant parmesan, but if you just don't like eggplant, you're probably still not going to like it.
Yeah, true.
So, and again, I don't want to overstate it either of saying that I don't like it because, you know, as someone who enjoys film and talking about film and knowing things about filmmaking and all of those things, like there's a lot to respect and admire about this movie that, you know, did not make it an unpleasant viewing experience, but I'm also just not as thrilled by it as I know a lot of people are. So, and that's fair.
Right. And some of the way, so I think some of the way that I think about the craft is like, you know, you could take literally any still frame from this movie and frame it, and it would look like an amazing photo.
Yeah, you know, it's funny just on that note, because I watched it a couple of weeks ago just to kind of refresh my memory as we were preparing to have this conversation. I just did a Google image search for Godfather Part 2, and it's kind of that. It's just a bunch of different shots from the movie. And yeah, it's like, you know, I mean, obviously these are specifically chosen shots, not just like random frames, but still it conveys what you're saying, which is that it's a great looking movie. Like every shot feels, you know, carefully chosen to convey something.
Yeah, so I was going to say, so you could lift any still frame from this movie, and it would be a beautiful paint or photo. You could just read the script and understand the story and it be an enriching story. You could watch one scene with no context of any of the other scenes and say, man, those are some powerful performances. You can listen to the score independent of the movie, and it sounds beautiful. And that's part of what, like I said, like I can, you know, how I've always described this movie is like a tapestry, is that each one of those threads is so beautiful on its own. And then when you weave them together into this movie, it becomes something bigger than each beautiful piece of thread. And that's why I mean, I enjoy it too, because I think that the richness that it gives to these characters that we invested in, if you enjoyed The Godfather, you became invested in these characters, then you see this, which just further details what happens to them. It's really powerful together. And I think it's part of why, just to quickly talk about Godfather Part 3, why that's such a letdown, because that doesn't advance anybody any further. It doesn't deliver the same, you know, it's just, it doesn't take it in, and it doesn't enrich you. Like you could, if you didn't know Godfather 3 existed and you only watched these two, you would be satisfied. If you watch Godfather 3, you still really only pay attention to these two, because everything that happens in that is really consequential to what you're trying, what the story that you're trying to be a part of, you know?
Right. It is exactly what we already imagine happening after Part 2.
Right.
So there's no surprise there. It's more just kind of like this movie finishes with everyone on a certain trajectory, and Part 3 is like, yep, still that.
Yes. And it's also why, you know, Coppola got so much crap for putting his daughter in it, because she isn't as good of an actress as the actresses in these versions. And not that she's poor, but in comparison, it is such a letdown when you're used to like every single level of performance in this movie being so tight. Including the last thing I'll talk about will be young Clemenza before we go on it, because he's awesome. But but everything is so tight, and then you have her and she's just like okay, and it just adds fuel to the fire of like why why people are so let down and like angered by that movie's existence. And I just don't ever watch it. I just sort of deleted it from my memory of existence.
Yeah, like I barely remember it. I feel like about 95% of what I remember of that movie is really just non-Pacino people doing an impression of his line where he's just when I thought I was out, he pulled me back in. Like it's not even from the movie. It's people talking about that line from the movie is about most of my memory of the movie.
It's just silly. Like it tries to like make it. I mean, I don't even remember the exact plot line, but there's something about like they're basically like taking on the Vatican. It's just odd.
Yeah, I don't remember it.
Got out over its skis a little bit. It just wasn't. It was unnecessary.
Mm-hmm. We can come back to what you were saying about young Clemenza, just because that I agree that there's some fun stuff in that plot line. And maybe we can just go ahead and talk about that. But certainly I feel like one of the sequence that I think I'm most clicked with in the movie, again, not to necessarily make it, anything down on the others, but just the scene where I feel like I was the most emotionally engaged was actually the scene where Vito is kind of just getting into this stuff. And there's that whole sequence of like, oh yeah, come on, we're just going to go to my friend's house and get this rug.
Yes.
And it's like, this is your friend's house? Really? And just that whole sequence there's a lot of fun there.
Yeah. And the setup to that is good too. But I mean, and again, Bruno Kirby does a tremendous job. And it is a nice sort of comic relief amongst such a dark story.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's not overtly funny. It's just the situation is funny. Like when he first meets him and he like bangs on his window and throws him the bag. It's like, I'll come get this next week. And he looks in and it's a bunch of guns. And he's like, okay, what the hell was that?
Yeah.
And he shows up. He's like, oh, do you still have my stuff? Oh, great. Like, I want to give you this rug for your family from my friend.
Yeah, so come with me to come get it.
Come get it. Oh, and then they're getting the rug, and the cop shows up, and he just pulls out the gun, and he's like going up there, and Vito's kind of like, "What the hell is going on? Like, I knew this wasn't on the up and up, but this is a little like." He just sort of, but even De Niro in that scene is so great with it. He's just sort of watching it and taking it in. Is like, let's see what happens here. Not really passing judgment on it, just kind of like, this is not what I expected to do today. So where's this going?
But I feel like there's also just a little bit of an element that, it's like when it's in the larger context of the whole story that we know, you can kind of see the wheels turning too of this idea that like, I could do this. If this whole crime thing is really just people just freewheeling, doing whatever they want, and most of the time they're pretty stupid about it, and if they get away with it, it's just luck. I could do that. I think that's good, and it's a great sequence for sure.
Yes.
One of the things that I think might have been part of my reaction, as I kind of mentioned that I think it's possible that part of my feelings about this movie come from the broader societal context around this movie as opposed to the film itself. Because, it is iconic, right? It is one of those movies that, people talk about. And I think, you actually mentioned Fight Club earlier. And I think that where I feel like there's some interesting overlap is that even though the story being told in these movies is not a happy one, right? Like, Michael is an awful guy at the end. And even though he has lots of money and stuff, I wouldn't especially call his life glamorous.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there are a lot of people, who get way into the whole mob aesthetic, which is more like the actual mob movies. Most of them actually tends to show it not being super glamorous, or at least any glamour part that it ever has is washed away by the non-glamorous part by the end. But I feel like sometimes what gets taken away from the movie is like people take away the glamorous parts and then just kind of brush aside the non-glamorous parts. You know what I mean? And I feel like to some extent, The Sopranos kind of like almost exists to sort of interrogate that a little bit, I think, by making it so sort of banal, right?
Right. Well, and then there's the hilariously like self-referential film, The Graduate, or not The Graduate, The Freshman.
Yeah.
The Freshman, sorry.
Yeah. The Graduate's a different movie.
Just absolutely hilarious, like the way that it basically just plays up all of these like mob tropes with, in just an incredibly humorous way. And then the payoff at the end is that like it was all just a farce. You know, that one's so much fun because of it, but it's using the same constructs. So
I guess maybe part of what I'm reacting to is because obviously when we discuss movies as being part of this list, part of what we're talking about is influence, right? And I feel like to some extent, this is an example of a movie where the majority of the cultural influence as interpreted by a lot of the people who really love this movie. This is not to say that anyone who loves this movie feels this way, because obviously you don't, and a lot of people don't, interpret this movie and take it, for its own position of that Michael's a bad guy in this, and this is not a glamorous thing. But there are people who talk about this movie as though it is glamorous, right? They fetishize the big moments of like, you broke my heart, and, the kiss of death, and all of that stuff. And I think maybe part of my feeling is a negative reaction to people who have that reaction. That might be part of what holds me back from it a little bit. So it's not necessarily what this movie is saying, but it's what a lot of people apparently have taken away from it over time.
I can see that.
But, again, it's like, it's an interesting nuance to talk about, movies and having intended effects and unintended effects, right? And that's kind of like we talked about Fight Club, where you and I have discussed it before, where it's this whole thing where it sets up this whole thing where it presents a certain sort of ideology, lifestyle as being glamorous. And then the second half of the movie is showing how it's actually not. But then there's this whole subculture of usually guys online who fetishize the first half of the movie and pretend like the second half doesn't exist.
Right. Well, that's why I really love just another movie that's in that context is Scorsese's Scarface, where he just like, obviously it was before Fight Club, but he just leans into that from the beginning. I mean, he's never a good guy. Like, he's a terrible person from the opening scene till the ending scene where he's killed. Like, there is nothing redeemable about him. There's nothing good about it. But because of the way it portrays it with this largesse, like basically like a rap song, the whole movie is like one big giant rap song of success. And people just love it and eat it up. And Scorsese, he knew that's what he was doing. He's like, I'm gonna make this despicable mofo, but everybody's gonna love him because he's just gonna be so over the top.
Yeah.
Just the largesse of everything, you know. And like I said, lean in is the best word. He was like, I'm gonna make a movie and I'm just gonna lean into that idea.
You know, there's a lot of times people like to root for the bad guy because, you know, the whole idea of villains, they're charismatic and all that. I think that's
actually a line in Scarface. Like, he says that you want to root for him because he's the bad guy. Like, he says that in one of the character.
Yeah. So it's, you know, it just makes me think about, you know, tying it back to this one is like, would I have liked it more if, like The Untouchables comes to mind in the sense that that's a mob story, but it's also about the good question mark in parentheses guys trying to take them down, right? You know,
I'll make sure I want to fact check myself real quick. That was De Palma did Scarface, not Scorsese.
I think that's right.
It is. Yeah, it is.
So
okay. Sorry to derail you. I just out of the way before.
No, that's all right.
Anybody critiques me, it's Brian De Palma. Yeah.
No, well, yeah, no, that's a reasonable correction.
So The Untouchables shows also good.
Yeah, and I really like that one, and I think that part of what makes me think of that one more affectionately, at least superficially, like my brain tells me it's because there's good guys to root for, but it's also kind of complex in that regard. I mean, that one's kind of the anti-hero versus the actual villain, right? Like that's, you know, the Untouchables are mostly good. But I guess I'm
complex, like means to an end stuff in there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So, and that's where you can get into like anti-hero territory that like, they act like the bad guy, but for a good end. That's kind of often one of the tropes there, but in any event, so obviously we had a lot to talk about with Godfather Part 2. It is a very well-made movie, and there's lots of things to really like about it. I can even be enthusiastic about several of them at the same time that just when we talk about it, just purely on an emotional story impact, it doesn't move me as much as some of the others on this list.
Perfect. So I think it's probably time to move on to the Maltese Falcon.
The Maltese Falcon.
In part because this room, the lights don't get installed until Tuesday. Oh. So if I lose the sunlight, then we're going to be in trouble.
All right. So the Maltese Falcon is kind of, it's nice to pivot there because maybe it's, again, when we just come down to talking about films on a purely aesthetic level, in terms of tropes and subgenre themes and that sort of flavor, the film noir mystery, private eye detective stories and so on is like way more interesting to me than mob stories.
It's funny because I'm not that I'm not interested in those things, but I had an interesting reaction watching this movie again.
Oh yeah?
I mean, it's still good. I like noir. I like the fact that you felt like this came right out of like some pulp novel.
Yeah.
But like just some clever short story with a cool little twist at the end. Like, yeah, it's all. But when I first started watching it, like I just wasn't. I don't say I wasn't enjoying it, but I just didn't engage like the way I did with The Godfather Part 2 again. And I've seen both movies a number of times, and I knew. But The Godfather Part 2, man, when I turned that on, I was in for whatever 3 hours and 40 whatever it is, 2 hours and 40 minutes, whatever it is, like, and I just didn't do anything else with this. No. Not that I like got up and started doing other things, but my mind started to wander a little bit. And I was like, this isn't as good as I remember. It's not really engaging me. By the time it got to the end, I was like, oh, yeah, it is kind of cool the way it all kind of comes together. Like, that's kind of fun.
Yeah.
But the characters, I think, is what was, and it's not any fault of the movie. It's the time that it was.
Well,
it just
I
didn't
think
hold up as much for me.
I can,
And I
I can
don't know
see
why.
I can see that. I mean, I love film noir stories generally, and this one it's like an archetypal example of what is meant by a film noir story, But there are other ones that I like more personally. But I think one of the things that really struck home with me with what you were just saying is that in terms of the effect that they're trying to have on the viewer, The Godfather Part 2 is definitely working harder to envelop you in this world, this richly drawn world that it wants to bring you into and have you be there with the story and the characters for the duration and then return you to your own world, right? Maltese Falcon is really not trying to do that, right? It is not trying to present this as a rich, detailed world. It's almost just like it's I mean, nowadays we might call them tropes, but it's more like beats, it's story beats, right? It's
I mean, it's super pulpy, like
yeah,
not just film noir. It's
right.
very pulpy,
Yeah,
like,
and so it's going for a different effect, right? And to some extent, that's whether whatever you prefer. Like I'm not even saying it's necessarily a preferential thing, but like I totally get what you're saying, just in terms of like what Godfather does while you watch it is compel your attention and feel like it fills your field of view, so to speak, right? You lose track of whatever anything else might be happening, whereas Maltese Falcon does not demand your full attention in the same way, even if you're enjoying it.
Yeah, you kind of just have to accept things at face value, like that. It
Mm-hmm.
like it
There's
does
a lot more shorthand.
Yeah, just like kind of exactly like shorthand, like it's just telling you, and that's why I say it feels very pulpy, because it feels like a little short story.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll be like, "Oh, hey, these two are in love now," and there's no reason why they should be in love. Like, but they are. That's
right.
That's just
Well,
that's what happened.
it's funny because I think that is a good example of something where maybe partly because I know the story already, I'm able to just sort of edit out in my head that, he doesn't really, it's almost like a mean thing to do to imply at the end that he really loves her, but is going to send her up the river anyway. Like that whole thing of like, I'll wait for you. No, he won't. He had no intention. It's almost more like he's being extra mean and twisting the knife as he's going to send her away, to imply that even though I did have feelings for you, your charms worked on me, but I'm going to send you to prison anyway.
Yeah, and I will say, actually, I think that's probably one of the best parts about the movie, other than it did have that cool twist at the end, which is not, wasn't always common, in those kind of movies, which is what made it kind of good. Is that the Falcon turned out to like not actually be worth anything. Like it was like truly like a red herring.
One of my favorite parts of this story is actually not even so much that reveal as much as what follows it, where
they're going to like head off turkey or whatever.
Well, yeah, they're all disappointed for like 15 seconds, and then the wheels just start spinning up again. It's like, oh, well, see, obviously, if this one is fake, that means he must have been tipped off. And so when we stole it, we stole the wrong one. So he must still have the real one, and he would have it there. So what we need to do is make this plan. And I just love that they just immediately just go right back into it.
Right. As opposed to Occam's razor, which is that doesn't exist. This is all it was. This is all it ever was.
Yeah.
Move on.
That he almost duped you into paying way too much money for a simple, simple statute.
Doesn't statute. It is literally a red herring that is a black falcon.
Right. And see, like that is such a classic noir trope. The greed as being a primary motivation for a character, right? Like they want something to the point where pursuing it is actually actively bad for them, but they do it anyway just because the simple idea of getting the treasure is just that compelling. It's kind of like in Treasure of the Sierra Madre, right? It's just this idea of the greed as a corruption of people's souls, and that being, it's treated all in a very pulpy way. Is kind of a classic.
It's a plot of Tomb Raider still.
Well, yeah, it's. Yeah,
it's just a modern version of it.
Oh, sure, yeah. It's I love that. So the idea that they just start to spin this whole theory up again, like they're going to go off back into Europe and keep pursuing this thing, that more than anything else in the movie makes me feel like there's a larger world outside the story, right? The idea that there are these people out there searching for this mythical treasure.
Like a Reddit thread.
Yeah. It's like, immediately they were so sure they had just the thing, and they were willing to do anything to get it, including kill people. And it's also, this story is classic example of the MacGuffin idea, right? Like Notorious and Hitchcock's. Yeah. Well, I mean, red herring, I guess red herring's not quite what it is, but I understood what you meant. It's this idea.
Yeah, I was using MacGuffin was the term I meant in my commentary. Yeah.
Technically, it was still kind of a red herring if we buy into the idea that the guy who really had the real one made a fake one to be a decoy.
Yeah, but that's not what I was.
Yeah, MacGuffin is the point, though. The idea of it really, like, the idea of the Falcon itself being this incredibly valuable thing is 100% incidental to the story. None of the people pursuing it care anything about the actual historical value of it. It's all just a treasure to get. There's no one who has any kind of a personal sentimental connection to the idea of it, except that it's worth a lot of money. And it's become this thing where knowing the history of it is purely a means to an end. And so the idea of this Falcon, it could have been anything. It could have been a little box with a $ painted on it, for all the movie really cares about it. You know what I mean?
Could have been like whichever the Mission Impossible movie where the thing's called the
Rabbit's Foot. Yeah, that's 3.
3.
Yeah. Incidentally, the new one, Fallout's really good. Might be my favorite of the series, actually. And I'm a fan of that series. So anyway, not to get too distracted there, but yeah, that's another example, right? And the idea that the Maltese Falcon is also a good MacGuffin in the sense that even though from a plot perspective, it really doesn't matter what it is, it's still an evocative image, right? It is a thing that we can imagine even though we've never seen it. Like we see the black version of the Falcon only towards the end, right? But all throughout, like from the opening little title crawl, we're told of this amazing golden statue encrusted with gems and everything. We can imagine it. But it's just vague enough. I think it's just such a perfect little image of there. You can imagine what that might be like, but aren't you excited to see what it really looks like? That sort of thing.
Yes.
Yep. And so many of the other, classic noir private eye tropes are present in this. And I think that's part of what I like about it, just because I like those stories generally. And so even almost independent of the quality of this movie all by itself as a standalone film, it is such a classic version. It's almost the boiled down concentrate of this type of story, right? You got the classic private eye, Sam Spade, played really well by Humphrey Bogart. I wouldn't say it's like Humphrey Bogart's best performance in anything by a long shot, but at the same time, it's iconic, right? And just, the look and the clothes and the office and the the classy dame who walks in. Although it's interesting, just because, not to be too hard on Mary Astor or anything, but the assistant comes in and says, "Oh, she's a knockout," and then Mary Astor comes in and they're like, "Really? I mean, she's not bad looking, but also just kind of the clothes and the hair are sort of very not contemporary style, so it's a little bit." But in some ways, that's almost as incidental as what the Falcon is, because the trope of the femme fatale, the leggy dame who comes walking into the private eye's office, is just such a thing. And so this is another movie where it's difficult to watch and separate it entirely from the context of the genre around it, right? And while that was kind of a hindrance for my enjoyment with The Godfather, with this one, it's a perk as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, and that's why I said it was complex, the feeling watching this, because I didn't engage for a long time on it, and then by the end, though, I was still pretty satisfied, and that's why, like, I kept using the term pulp, because that's what pulp is about, is being like, it's like candy, like, it's satisfying without having to be deep, and I think what I love the most, I mean, Bogart is the best in this. I mean, he literally drives this movie. If he wasn't, like, just how flippant he is about everything. Like, it starts off, the movie begins with his partner being killed. Well, it doesn't begin, but that's one of the earliest scenes. And he's just like, I mean, he knew what he was getting into. And by the way, I was sleeping with his wife, so I don't really want to.
When someone kills your partner, you're supposed to do something about it. Yeah. And it's like this abstract external code, completely separate from any actual personal connection he had to.
Yeah, he literally
Miles Archer as a man.
I mean, the next scene, he's like, make sure you take his name off the door.
Yeah.
He's dead.
I kind of like imagining that the two of them have kind of not been getting along for a long time, but it's
like with his wife. They probably been getting along.
But specifically, I feel like the best thing about Miles Archer, as far as Sam Spade was concerned, is that his existence meant that Sam didn't actually have to make any promises to Miles's wife.
Right. He could just,
it's like, well, but you're married, so.
You're married to my partner. We can't talk about that.
Yeah. We just sleep together sometimes.
And then the other scene that sort of ties the bow on it at the end, when he's like, "Oh, I mean, I'm definitely reporting you to the police." Like, I mean, I love you. I'll wait for you.
Sure. Yeah.
After you go to jail. Yeah.
Yeah. But like, that's a part of the whole thing too, right? Is that whole cynical private eye trope who's jaded about everything.
Yeah. He takes it to such an extreme level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, like, not to make this about my story, but like the book I'm working on right now is get the edited version of my serial that I wrote, and that it starts as a private eye story. Literally, the opening scene is the private eye, and the leggy dame walks in. I mean, I'm diving into that trope deliberately. I'm a fan of this style and type of story. I like those things about it. And then, of course, it's kind of extra fun just with all the context to have Humphrey Bogart in this story, and then Peter Lorre and Sidney Greenstreet are in it. And it's just like, it's in some ways, it's like a lot of the same people that are in Casablanca, which is kind of just fun.
And we'll get into that when we get to Casablanca. But I think the fact that this movie exists and is good, it sets up part of why Casablanca was such lightning in a bottle.
Yeah.
Because it was, just real briefly, it was all these guys who were just under contract by that movie theater, by the movie company, to just churn out these kind of movies. And yet, because these guys were so talented, when you get them together, they were producing things that were above par. Mm-hmm. And so Casablanca is like the culmination of all of that. But here's kind of like the first like Tinder spark of wait a minute, like these guys, when you put them all together, these actors and actresses who are just like our contract guys who are just doing 9-to-5 work, essentially, was what it was at that day and age.
It was just 1 year after this one.
Right. And so that's why I call it like the Tinder that sort of sparked that, is You know, somebody along the way saw the chemistry of these guys and said, you know what? Even though we're just doing a contract movie, let's get these guys together who are all really good at what they do, and let's try to do it just a little bit better than just churning a movie out. And it just connected. Like I said, lightning in a bottle on that one, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I think this movie is important, that they are all in it, you know. So
yeah, I really like both Peter Lorre and Sidney Greenstreet, although there's some subtle makeup used for Peter Lorre's character that I feel like they darken his face a little bit, and it seems maybe worth just mentioning in passing. It's definitely the sort of thing, because I feel like he's meant to be, slightly exotic.
yeah,
but also certainly super gay coded.
Yes, both of those things. Those are good words to describe it. I'm glad you used them.
The very first thing that we learn about Peter Lorre's character, Joel Cairo, first of all, his last name is Cairo, which is meant to evoke that he's maybe Egyptian. Is he an Egyptian guy? His name is Cairo. I don't know.
Yeah,
Joel,
I think it's just like nondescript form.
Yeah, exactly. And but like the very first thing we learn about him is that his business card is scented, and it is portrayed on screen as you know what that means. I mean, that's like that's how it's portrayed. And so certainly it's there's things that are not as you wouldn't want to do it that way today because it's kind of not cool, but it's certainly very much in the mix of what went on, in movies like this at that time. You know what I mean? It's like the idea that you would show anyone being actually gay. No, you never would. But you kind of hint at it in ways that everyone kind of knows, but you never actually say.
Right.
And it's almost always attributed to a bad guy. Like, even though, like, one of my favorite Hitchcock movies is Strangers on a Train, which does this a lot also, which is the bad guy character in that movie. They never say he's gay, but he acts super gay.
Yes.
And so there's a whole larger conversation to be had, perhaps, about gay coding in classic Hollywood movies that perhaps we wouldn't need to go into too much more without research or something, but it's certainly part of what I noticed in watching the movie is like, yep, there they are using gay coding as an example of what makes this a bad guy that's not to be trusted. So I'm kind of saying these like as I smile. I hope nobody is taking from that I think it's a good thing for the movie to have done, so much as I think it's somewhat amusing to just view it now in the broader context of how times have changed. But certainly using gay coding for a villain character is not something that Hollywood grew out of quickly. I mean, Disney movies did this over and over again during the 90s and even a little into the 2000s. I think they're moving away from it now, but, it's not subtle in a lot of places. And in any case, just his character being sort of this, exotic stranger who's a little dangerous, but also potentially weak in a way that, we're supposed to be really satisfied when, he tries to pull a gun on Sam, but Sam just punches him out and takes the gun away and then immediately sits down next to him on the couch and starts going through his wallet, which I thought is amusing. And Sam Spade as a character just being, like, even when he's not sure what's going on, he always feels like he just has a demeanor of being in control of the situation, even when he is definitively not, like when he is being drugged by Sidney Greenstreet's character.
Yep.
Which, and again, it's just like in terms of non-subtle storytelling, the guy's name is Casper Gutman, and everyone calls him the Fat Man. And it's just like, yeah, okay. Gutman, sure. All right. But at the same time, Sidney Greenstreet is a great character actor, of this time too. Just to this, he gets to be the guy who tells us, like, we've learned a little bit about the story of the Falcon from the title card, but like, he's the one that tells us in the story, right? He's the one that tells Sam what it is.
Right, and his delivery and sort of the way he makes his eyes sparkle as he describes what he's looking for is what makes us believe that it's something it's worth chasing for these guys.
Yeah.
Like his delivery in that scene is perfect for that. It's not just standard exposition. It does enrich it a little bit,
Right.
And this is probably a part about the part where I started to turn a little bit and start to kind of lock back in with the movie, because this is where things start to get just a little bit. Once we started getting all of those other pieces to the movie, like when it's really just like Sam and his secretary and the wife and the girl, and like just sort of those interactions, like the sort of the flippantness around the girls, and like like that's the part that just never really that was engaging me. Well, and start getting these guys in and add some actual like development to it is when I started to click back.
I totally agree, especially in the context of like the first scene where the partner is actually there. I actually had the thought to myself, it's like, oh, come on, go and get killed already, so we can get to the good part of this movie. Because we don't care about him. We're not supposed to care about him. He only exists on screen, even for a scene, just so that we'll know who they're talking about when he's dead. So,
yep.
He is not intended to be a character that we emotionally invest in. And he's kind of, he's not an especially appealing character even then. I mean, he's the guy who's kind of, we learn the whole thing is, this woman comes to Sam and then Miles shows up, right? And then tries to kind of take over everything. So we almost are meant to resent him from the beginning. But like the sequence where he has talked with Gutman the first time is really cool too. There's some actually somewhat subtle stuff going on in there that, things that could be read superficially as just weird, but you can kind of piece together what Sam is doing. For example, being really calm at first where he's getting the information and getting a read on this guy. And then once he has figured out, oh, this is the guy who gets off on knowing more about what's going on than anybody else and likes to play at being in charge of everything and having everything under control. Well, how about I play into what he already thinks of me, which is to say a greedy loose cannon who's going to do dirty work for him. And so that's where he gets into the whole thing. Like he throws the glass and he starts shouting and is like, no, you're going to give me more money for my information and we'll see. And he acts all mad, but then we see him as soon as he walks out of the room, he's just wiping his hands and smiling like, yep, that went well. Because of course that he is calm for the first part of the scene while he's getting a read on what the situation is. And then he says, I need to provoke a response here. And so he does. Let's talk a little bit about Bridget O'Shaughnessy, Mary Astor's character, because she, I think, not in a sympathetic way, because she's definitely a femme fatale in the sense of she's lying from word one, and she really doesn't ever convey any kind of an honest emotion at any point, except perhaps in being sincerely not wanting to go to prison. But that the whole dynamic of her being the fickle sort of woman who's lying for her own ends, but at the same time kind of doing her own thing in this. She's operating in the same world of these crazy treasure hunters, right? As her own agent, right? The whole thing kicks off because she talks this other guy into cutting out their business partner to try to take this thing for their own, right? That's what instigates the whole thing that ends up, bringing, all of this into it. And then that guy betrays her, so she has a private eye to find him, and so on. So, but I like that character type, and I like the dynamic that it leads to, where she is used to playing on men's sympathies, but Sam is the one that can see through it, even at the same time that he kind of admires the attempt. And I think that to any extent that he has any real feelings for her at all, it's really, I think, only on there can be a respect for, she's going after what she wants, and she's going to do what she thinks she needs to do to get it. And there's something kind of appealing about that, even if he's not going to let her get away with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, just to summarize what you said there and how I felt about it, I liked that she has agency.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was an important part of the film, even if it's somewhat cloudy, because there is the part at the end where she's like, no, but I really was in love with you, and it's like, that seemed weird,
Yeah.
But, so she still followed the tropes of being like this damsel in distress, but she was also this femme fatale. But when you wrap it up, she, like you said, she made decisions that caused and affected the story, which I think was important to her character, and I liked that about it.
Yeah,
not clean,
Right. Well, I'll agree that it is muddied a little bit at the end with the stuff he says, because my read on her character is that she didn't mean any of it at any point. She's just hoping that by playing the woman in need of assistance, don't you want to take care of me, you big strong man? I feel like that's just her play.
That's interesting. Yeah, I didn't take it that way, but that would change some of that, in my opinion. So
yeah. So my read on her character is that she never meant any of it, and at the end, she's desperate because she realizes it's not working like she thought it was with him. He's saying that she's going to go to prison. He has double crossed her in a way that surprised her, and she is upset and relying on her one trick. So she's kind of trying to say, come on, you don't want to send me to prison? Surely not, right? Don't you remember all the good times? Like in the 2 days since we've known each other, that when I was a perfect stranger before, and I've been lying to you ever since in every interaction we've had, but that was all fun, right? Like,
yeah, so honestly, that would make a lot more sense
from her side. Yeah, that's
both sides. Like, just the fact that like they're both still playing each other at that point. Whereas I think I had sort of defaulted to, the movie's just telling us this is how they feel, even though there's no reason to believe it. It would make more sense that was an extension of their, cat and mouse manipulation of each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And see, I like to think that Sam doesn't really buy it either. He doesn't really feel for her. He's not really going to wait for her. And it's in some ways just like, by continuing to play the game but send her to prison anyway, is kind of being extra mean about it, twisting the knife. But I will concede that the movie doesn't really make it clear that that's the case. The movie doesn't really tell us that. If we take his words at face value, we would believe, like what you were saying, that he actually did really fall in love with her. And that seems plausible in the context of a movie like this, because that happens in movies like this, is that two characters are in love because the movie tells us that they are. There doesn't have to be anything more to it in movies necessarily, right? So, but that said, I feel like there's really no moment in the movie that gives us any sense that he's actually in love with her. except perhaps where he says that he is at the end, at the same time that he is sending her to prison.
That's fair. So.
But I think that there are several occasions throughout where he basically, multiple times in the movie, calls her on lying to him and basically is saying, look, I know that the initial story you gave me is not true, and I'm still maybe willing to help you if you tell me what's actually going on. And then she's continuing to kind of try to play act for him and just, shift the game around. And he is basically just calls her on it every time, but frequently says, no, that's pretty good. I feel like someone else might have fallen for that. And I feel like there's an extent to where he actually does kind of admire her moxie for all that. Her using the skills in her toolbox to try to get what she wants. But I don't know, though, because like I said, I'll concede that the movie, some of that could be headcanon, because the movie doesn't really tell us how Sam really feels.
No, it makes sense, though. So.
Yeah. Trying to think if there was anything else that just stood out to me. I kind of like the running gag of the young thug Wilmer that Sam basically keeps humiliating, and that just kind of this ongoing thing that also becomes kind of tense at the end, because if the whole joke has been that he doesn't know what he's doing and he might do something stupid, the fact that he's holding a gun and being threatened with prison, it's like, well, that could blow up in your face really fast.
Yep.
But I guess we can just briefly discuss, you kind of mentioned it already at the end, but just the way everything sort of turns at the end, where the culmination of Sam's plan is to have played in to their conspiracy like he is really in on it, like, I'm going to help you guys find this thing for a cut. But when it's really all just about finding out the truth about the situation so that he can then get them all arrested. Because that's ultimately what he does, and it's portrayed when it happens as having always been the plan.
Right.
Even though we are not clued in until then. Like, I can't help but wonder, like, I can't remember watching this movie when I didn't know the story. You know what I mean? There must have been a first time, but I feel like I'm not sure how, like, do you think anyone would watch this movie and really think he is sincerely cooperating with these people and not just trying to
I think that's
solve the case? Yeah. But that said, I think it's very satisfying. And so I think that we're meant to understand that that's what he's doing throughout. But it's satisfying in the way it all works. We can see him making the effort to fool them, and it's still being this dance of they're not sure to whether they trust him, because even if he's on the level that he's going to help them for a cut, they would rather not give him a cut. So if they can cut him out and still get the thing, they absolutely would. So it's dangerous regardless. But also, like, how's he, as one guy who's already kind of in hot water with the police, going to turn this whole thing around? Well, seeing him accomplish it is pretty satisfying.
It is. You're right. Yeah.
Even though I think, there's a little bit of just, again, like Hollywood off-screen magic where we can just have him call the police and say, yeah, here's the description of these 3 guys that just left this hotel. Go arrest them. And then you can just say, yep, they'll take care of it from here. And we get just the police confirming later, yep, we got him. And it's like, okay, good, because that seems like the weak point of the plan. That's the weak link of that particular chain, is the idea that you could just say, yep, just go arrest them wherever they are.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. So I think that probably, well, let's see. I don't know if there's it did get nominated for some awards. It was nominated for Best Picture, Best Supporting Actor, and Best Screenplay, but did not win any of them.
I think that's fair. Mm. Was a nominated worthy film.
Yeah. I feel like this is well, did I lose my I lost my thing where I had the spreadsheet up. But the I feel like this movie, more than a lot of the movies we've talked about, is where it is more because of like its overall place in cinema history. It's like a stand-in for a whole subgenre almost more than it exists on its own.
Yeah. Which is why I'm going to leave it on the list, but I'm going to move it down.
Yeah, fair.
I think do that if you.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So let's go ahead and do that if you know where you're wanting to put it.
Yep. So I'm going to leave the Godfather where it is.
Okay.
And I'm going to take the Maltese Falcon down to 77, below Saving Private Ryan, but above Shane.
All right. All right. Let's see if I can make that happen smoothly this time. Nope. All right, so and so technically that makes the Godfather move up one.
Move up, yeah, which I like. I want.
Yeah. Right. So I think a little more complex with me because obviously we talked about the complexity of my feelings about Godfather, because certainly recognizing, even if I didn't engage with it as much emotionally, certainly its influence on cinema and all of that sort of thing, and the skill of its making. Wait, what did I do? I don't think I put Maltese Falcon in the right place.
Keep talking.
Okay, yeah, I definitely did something wrong. So yeah, you just fix it. That's all right. Something about they changed the way the commands work in Cheats, and it's got me all discombobulated now. I don't think I'm going to move the Godfather down too much, but I am going to move it down somewhat. Just because what's the point of a list like this if it doesn't include personal enjoyment as part of the criteria?
Correct.
So I think I'm going to move it down to 67, which is after Silence of the Lambs, before Bonnie and Clyde.
That's fair.
And then Maltese Falcon. I can absolutely just concede that I feel like its presence on the list is almost less about its own merits and more about what that kind of story means for cinema. Because there's not really any other sort of like classic noir detective stories on the list, I don't think. I mean, Chinatown is probably the closest, but that was certainly a more modern sort of reimagining of that type of story, right?
Yeah.
That's further up on the list. We'll definitely be talking about that. I don't think there were really any others, though, that are like, the classic sort of Private Eye story. So I'm going to keep it. I'm going to keep it relatively high, though. I think I'm going to put it. I'm surprised just looking at my own list at how high I have Intolerance. Maybe just because I think that was a cinema literacy influence sort of thing. I think I'm going to put it in between Bridge on the River Kwai and Intolerance.
Fair also.
Right. And I will adjust those and get those to where they need to be. In the meantime, our next two movies are going to be Apocalypse Now at number 30 and Double Indemnity at number 29. And so of those, I have seen both. You have not seen Double Indemnity. Is that correct?
Not that I remember. So I'm excited to see it.
I recall it. It's actually another, sort of classic noir, but leaning away from the whole private eye trope element. But it's pretty good. And I remember first watching it and thinking Fred McMurray I knew from My Three Sons, and it was weird to see him in such a very different role. I used to watch My Three Sons on Nick at Night. But Apocalypse Now is a movie that I was borderline obsessed with for a period in college. So I have strong feelings about it. One thing that I guess maybe we want to briefly just discuss before we get into it is, as far as rewatching it is concerned, watch Redux or the original?
It's on here as the original, but I'm willing to watch both if that is the... we want to discuss the differences.
Like we did for Amadeus, I think it would be interesting to be able to discuss the differences between the two versions.
I'm willing to do that.
All right, great.
I have to watch both.
Yeah, I think somewhat like Amadeus, my own general feelings going into like where I stand right now before rewatching either is that while the additions to Redux are interesting, I feel like the movie actually works better without them in line. But
it's my general feeling too, but
yeah,
we'll
all right.
talk about that next time. So.
Yes, indeed. So that'll be next time. Hopefully we can make it happen sometime soonish, but we'll have to see. So in the meantime, thank you everybody for watching and or listening, and we'll be back for more movies hopefully soonish, like I said.
Sounds good.
All right, you can find a copy of our spreadsheet at christianaellis.com.
Perfect.
Good night.
Good night.